Welcome everyone to this forum that Dr. Wright has prepared and planned for today. I have been chairing the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Committee that Dr. Wright referred to in the school over the past academic year. And one of the goals that we had for the committee was to increase our programming that we offer in the school around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of those have been ongoing through the year. And then over the month of July, we hope to schedule 3 events, of which Dr. Wright's is the first happening today. So we're delighted that Dr. Wright, who brings expertise in the field of LGBT work, and his legal training and his PhD work in higher ed, all of those come nicely together today in the presentation that Dr. Wright will be taking us through about the recent Supreme Court decision on LGBTQ rights around employment. So I'm looking forward to learning much today. I always do learn a lot when I have conversations with Dwayne, and I think today will be no different. So Dwayne, thank you so much again for preparing this presentation for today. And I, along with all the others, look forward to being educated and to learning something that we didn't know through your presentation today. So thank you.
So let's start to rock and roll a little bit here. I'm going to share a PowerPoint I've prepared for you. I do not intend this to be a lecture, more of a conversation, but I did want to have a little bit of structure. So this is Bostock and the future of LGBT employment and education. Wanted to say welcome and thank you everyone for showing up. It's been a crazy semester, an even crazier 6 weeks, and for many of us, even crazier month. The exhaustion must be setting in for many, if not all of us. So I should not go and I would not go further without saying thanking you for spending your time here today with us. You could be anywhere you wanted to be now, at least virtually through Zoom and other things, and you chose to be here. And for that, I am grateful. So here's our agenda for today. I want to do a little bit of stage setting. Then I want to present the Bostock case. Then I want to spend the majority of the time actually on a question and answer period. And then I want to leave a little bit of time at the end for a little bit of community discussion. So more specifically, what we as a community need to continue to do, to start doing, to ensure GSEHD is welcoming community for anyone that may be LGBTQ, A+, etc. So stage setting, presentation, question and answer, and conclusion is kind of my agenda for today. I will say that there are a few caveats before we kind of get started. One, this is not legal advice. I am happy to talk to any individuals one-on-one in which you could retain the sanction of attorney-client privilege, but this is not the appropriate time for that. So if anyone does have any specific questions about any specific scenarios, the law we're going to talk about right now is not retroactive, but if anyone has any specific questions, please do contact me offline. We want to have a little bit more of a research discussion than an HR discussion. So specific scenarios to you in the workplace, or if you want a center, or if you want a research lab, and you want to know, based on this case, is a particular practice no longer allowed or should no longer be allowed, the most appropriate place for that question is going to remain the Dean's Office, and via the Dean's Office, General Counsel for GW. However, I do want to focus on questions that relate to your research agenda, or generally general intellectual curiosity. We will not have enough time. I have about an hour and 15 minutes to kind of summarize what I learned over 5 courses in 3 years of law school. And 5 courses is about 15 credits. We take about 92 in law school. We're talking about 15% of my entire law school experience. So know that as my students know, I teach with my heart, not with my clock. And we will not have enough time, but we'll try to get in as much as possible. This will not be the only discussion. So we're not just doing this because of things that happened over the last weeks, and we're just going to do this and never remember it again, maybe until Pride 2021. Hopefully, we will have more discussions, but that will be up to the community. And that's why we have the time at the end to see what you would like to hear. Please do use the chat function if you have any questions, or you can DM me. During the presentation, I'll be pretty focused on the presentation, but any questions you put during the presentation, I will be sure to get to them during the Q&A. And with those caveats, are there any initial questions before we get started? Any initial questions? Maybe I should pull up the chat so I can see. All right, seeing and hearing none, I'm going to go through this at a particularly strong pace. Please do not be insulted by that. I just want to make sure that we sufficiently get to Q&A. Jim Williams wants to know, will I introduce my own work? Well, this particular work is focused on the case, but I will try to leave particular nuggets of where my research agenda connects to it as we go through. Hopefully. So setting the stage, this year, even in the craziness of what's going on, we celebrated the 51st anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which coincidentally leads into the 50th anniversary of Pride, the first Pride being June 28th, 1970. As a result of that, and my affiliation with the LGBT community, I approached Dean Green and said that we should do a GSEHD Pride Forum, which we showcase some type of issue, attention going towards the LGBT community, and particularly the students that we do research on and we service. The intention is that this will probably, likely, hopefully become an annual affair with both homegrown and outside talent, and that, you know, from now on, GSEHD will use this Pride Forum as a way to both honor those in the GSEHD community that are self-identified as LGBT and have some discussion around those issues as it affects research agendas. So the Stonewall riots, as I said, happened about 51 years ago. They were indeed an uprising. This was a bar that was a pretty speakeasy type bar, owned and operated at the time by, I guess, what you would call the mafia. And the police typically, routinely, and legally did raids on gay bars to shake them down for more protection racket money and to actually enforce the public laws at the time, which not only excluded homosexual sex, but also excluded anyone of a certain gender assigned at birth from wearing clothes of a different gender. And I want to point out at the onset that Stonewall was led by 2 LGBT, more importantly, trans women of color. To your left, you have Sylvia Rivera, and to your right, you have Marsha P. Johnson. And I'll come back to this point in a second. So in honor of the Stonewall riots, which many people see as the beginning of the gay rights revolution in America, I wouldn't call it the beginning, but it's colloquially known as the beginning. The first Pride happened a year later. It was called Christopher Street, which is one of the streets at intersecting Greenwich Village, where Stonewall is at. Gay Liberation Day. It eventually evolved to prides, and now there are prides throughout not just the country, but throughout the world as well, Rio and other places. So what we've seen is we've seen progress, right? And to your right, you see that we experienced this year the ascendance of a out homosexual man running for president. Revolutionary if you just think about where we were 10 years ago. To your left, I'm sorry, and to your right, you have the transgender tipping point. which is Lorraine Cox on the cover of Time magazine. If you zoom in, and I'm sure you can't, the Lorraine Cox Time magazine cover says June 9th, 2014. So there has been progress since then, but we still have a lot to go. And part of the predominant effects are around being felt by Black and Latinx trans women, trans women of color. And this is so ironic when you think about the fact that it was trans women of color against Martha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera that led the Stonewall riots. And here we are, 51 years later, and a lot of the discrimination that still exists and the desperate treatment and desperate impacts fall still on Black and Latinx trans women of color. Here are some of the pictures. I'm spending a little bit of an extended time here because I would like all my colleagues to know that at some point these were students, high school students, middle school students, early childhood students, community college students, higher education students. They may be your students in the future, and they need your support, not just as members of the community, but otherwise as well. And of course, we know the local context that we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning people here at GSEHD. And as we look to the national problems, the theoretical problems, our epistemological and ontological stance, we also look to make sure our domestic communities are fair, balanced, and tolerant, which is part of the work of this forum. So a few terms before I continue. This is a mnemonic I use in my classroom. I first used it when I was teaching gender discrimination to constitutional law students, and I have since used it in my higher ed classes as well. This is a gender-bred person. It's slightly research-backed, but it is accurate to my research. I am currently working, to Dr. Williams' point, on a law review article arguing for masculinity as a property interest. The same way someone owns a Benz or a house, we own masculinity as well. So I think it definitely is generative, and if any one of my colleagues wants this to look it over or use this in a class or two, please do let me know. I can send it to you. What we have here are some independent but interrelated parts, and the emphasis in the middle of the screen is that they're not equal to each other. We have gender identity, which is how you conceive of yourself on a scale of womanness and madness. Gender expression, which is divided between femininity and masculinity, separate from gender identity, which is how you conceive yourself. Gender expression is how you express yourself. Then we have anatomical sex, or as many people call it, sex assigned at birth. This is the sex assigned at birth by the doctor. And then separately, we have who a person is sexually attracted to and romantically attracted to. We're about to use pronouns to introduce myself, and hopefully some people will use it when we get to the Q&A. And this is where this comes from, designating the difference between gender identity, gender expression, and sex assigned at birth. So a little bit about me, hopefully not too much, because I hate talking about myself. My name is Dwayne Kwaysee Wright Barrington III. The proper way to do it is to not capitalize the K, but I'm not that special yet, so you go ahead and spell it how you want. My friends call me the rebel researcher. I'm not sure why that is, but I do like breaking norms. A little bit of application to what we just saw. My name, of course, is Dwayne Kwaysee Wright Barrington III. I'm a Black man. My pronouns are he, him, and his. My gender identity is man. My gender expression is masculine. My sex assigned at birth is male, which makes me cisgender because my gender identity and my sex assigned at birth match. This is contrasted to if your gender identity and your sex assigned at birth did not match, which would make you transgender. And for these last two, I wanted to point this out. Me personally, I'm sexually attracted to both male and females, romantically attracted to both masculine and feminine people. Two big points here. One, these are independent traits. One does not lead to another. One does not define another. we're almost defining these 5 characteristics independently. 2, I've highlighted the last 2 because had I not told you that, you would not know that. So therefore, I am positioned differently than a member of the LGBT community who may have a different gender identity or a different gender expression than their assigned at birth. And that is a privileged trait in my mind, as also as being a male and expressing masculinely. So people can have privilege within their oppression, as well as have oppression within privilege, as I am a male and have the male privilege, but I still suffer from the badges of racism and white supremacy here in the United States. So again, if anyone wants this as a mnemonic, please do let me know. A little bit more about me. So I went to a law school in Penn State. I had the honor and the privilege at this law school of taking both employment discrimination and the advanced employment discrimination class, because at the time I was not sure which bar I was going to take. And the Pennsylvania bar, which is the exam you take to be a lawyer, actually has employment discrimination on it. In addition to my employment discrimination work in law school, I participated in the Civil Rights Appellate Clinic for Penn State, in which I had the honor of writing amicus briefs to employment discrimination cases in the Supreme Court. And I participated on a team that wrote one and led a team that wrote another during my 2 years in the Civil Rights Appellate Clinic. So that's where my sort of desire and research for LGBT employment discrimination comes from, my general employment discrimination sort of background in law school. After law school, I actually transitioned straight to my PhD program, but the areas of practice I've maintained are employment discrimination and immigration. So if anyone was wondering why this is particularly close to me. Continuing on, because I know I do want to leave much time for Q&A. A brief history of LGBT people at the court. So many people might start this history with Bowers or with Baker. I start with One Incorporated versus Olson, and some of us that are more mature in age, like fine wine, would remember One magazine from back in the day. And I want to point 2 things out. One, this was an early win for the LGBT community in the court, which said that a homosexual literature in and of itself is not profane, not obscene, and therefore is protected by the First Amendment. This is only, for our history buffs, 4 years after Brown versus Board of Ed, which is in 1954. So for our critical race theorists in the room, if there might be any, what you see here is the interest convergence of certain Black interests, desegregation in the 1950s during the Cold War, and the divergence of LGBT people's interest as we go on into the Cold War, because we were seen as subvergent and a liability and easily manipulated by Soviet spies and etc. From 1958, we can fast forward to 1971, which is Baker versus Nelson. Easy case to assess, and I have it as an L down here, and it said that gay marriage was not even a political question, which meant that not only was there no gay marriage in 71, but it wasn't a question that merited the attention of the court. So between 71 and 86, there was some tension within the LGBT community about should we go to the court, should we go to the court. Eventually, a case that had to do with laws against sodomy, laws against non-penetrative sex, non-vaginal penetrative sex, in Georgia came to the court, and the question was, is that law as applied to only homosexuals illegal? The Georgia law actually applied to, it was an anti-sodomy law that applied to both heterosexual and homosexual people. And it was adjudicated and upheld on that right. The deciding vote was Justice Lewis Powell, who was talking to his clerk before he voted against the right to have gay sex in this case, and did not know that the clerk was gay himself, because the clerk felt he could not come out. And he's written about this years later. One of the first wins produced by Justice Kennedy was Romer. Before Romer, we have the Bill Clinton initiative, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I have that down as a win and an L. Happy to answer questions about that in the Q&A. Romer was a different type of case because it wasn't supposed to really be a gay case. It was supposed to be a political participation case, but nonetheless, that law, which for anyone that's not familiar, the city of Denver wanted to have a non-discrimination LGBT law. The state of Colorado decided, no, you can't do it. We're going to ban any LGBT discrimination laws because those are special rights in any of our municipalities in Colorado. And that law, the Colorado Amendment saying no city can have an LGBT non-discrimination act, was struck down. That prompted a lot of people to think that the nation then passed DOMA, which is the Defense of Marriage Act, and defined marriage as between a man and a woman for all federal purposes. But Bill Clinton did come back 2 years later and pass a non-discrimination law in the civil service. And for many years, this was the only non-discrimination ordinance in the books, this Executive Order 13087. Ours was eventually overruled, and consensual homosexual sex was given constitutional rights status in 2003 in Lawrence. This was followed up by the Matthew Shepard Crime Prevention Act in 2009 under a new administration, and the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2010. And of course, we have Windsor then that overruled the Defense of Marriage Act, or Obergefell that gave us legal marriage, and that leads us here today to Bostock versus Clayton County. Picking up speed because I do want to save time for questions. Prior to Bostock, 23 states and the District of Columbia, and about 400 cities in states that didn't have protection had some discrimination-based protections for sexual orientation and gender identity. So after 2015 in Obergefell, we had the odd situation where, and this has been often stated, you could have been married on Monday and fired on Wednesday for being married, because most states did not have protections. Up to the decision which came a couple of weeks ago, there were more states that had legalized medical and recreational marijuana than had protected the rights of LGBT people. And I don't say that to be detrimental or pejorative to anyone that may smoke marijuana. I just say that to kind of show you where the country was just 4 weeks ago. So as you can see, it's a hodgepodge here. The dark purple is, I think, the best, those that protected prior to Bostock, both gender identity and sexual orientation. The light teal, those that only did sexual orientation, and everywhere in between. Bottom line, there was no national standard. So we have now the case of Bostock versus Clayton, which was consolidated with two other cases. To your left in the wheelchair, we have the transgender plaintiff here, Amy Stevens. To your right, we have the two homosexual plaintiffs. At the bottom, we have Gerald Bostock, and at the top, we have Donald Zorder. Donald actually died before this case came to trial, so he is no longer with us, but the two other plaintiffs enjoyed a victory. And the holding of the court is an employer who fires an individual merely for being gay or transgender violates the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Once again, an employer who fires an individual merely for being gay or transgender violates Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. How did we get there? Okay, well, first, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 may be the most important legislation when it comes to civil rights of our time outside of the 14th and the 15th Amendment. Here's a very famous picture of Lyndon Baines Johnson signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act with Martin Luther King right over his shoulder. There's lots of sections in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Let's focus on one, Title VII, which again prohibits discrimination by covered employers on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination by covered employers on the basis of race, color, religion, or national origin. Often left out, it also prohibits discrimination on an individual because of his or her association with another individual of a particular race, color, religion, or national origin, such as a white partner in an interracial marriage. And that would extend today as well after this decision. So you may say, who applies to Title VII? This may purvey a few questions that may come up in the question and answer section. Well, first of all, you need 15 employees. There's a whole bunch of other legal language there that you don't need to necessarily focus on. And we will send this slide out once it's corrected, given any suggestions. But 15 employees is what's covered in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VII. Key here are the exemptions, people that are fully exempted, even before Bostock, from Title VII. Most of these were exempted at the time that the law was passed. Most federal government employees, except for the big wigs up top, and that recently changed very recently. Federally recognized Native Americans, tribes. I think a lot of questions may come with this point. Religious groups performing work connected to their religious activities, including associated education institutions. Religious groups, and here's the key word, my friends, performing work connected to the group's religious activities. So I've often gotten the question, well, Dwayne, after Bostock, can a Catholic university fire someone for being gay? Well, it depends. Is that gay person, lesbian, transgender, or bisexual, performing work related to the church's religious activities? Someone teaching Bible study or Bible class at a Catholic university or a Catholic school, yes. Someone teaching math, probably no, but this is going to come down to interpretation by the court. Finally, in the exemptions, bona fide nonprofit membership organizations are also exempt from Title VII. So I just want to be very clear what we're talking about here. For Title VII, we're talking about desperate treatment, where you have about direct or indirect evidence, meaning that there has to be some, if not smoking gun, evidence. If it's direct evidence and the employer just says, okay, I did it, I'm sorry, we can go to arbitration. Most of the time it's indirect evidence, and here is what happens. You, the employee, says, ex-employer fired me because I was gay, lesbian, or transgender. If you get the prima facie case, and I don't know if you can see this, but you're part of the protected class, which now extends to both sexual identity and sexual orientation and sexual expression. I was qualified and I applied for the job. I was rejected, and then the defendant hired a man or something else with the same qualifications that are opposite to your protected class. So those are the prima facie cases. If you get that, the burden shifts now back to the employer to give a non-discriminatory legitimate reason. If the employer cannot do that, they lose the case. If the employer can, they win the case. And in a nutshell, that's how most desperate treatment cases go. Desperate impact, however, is something completely different. Desperate impact means that there are no evidence, but the certain policy still excludes statistically members of a protected class. There's no evidence of actual intentional discrimination, but you requiring 7 articles has resulted in no African Americans for the last 10 years. That's a whole separate beast. So I necessarily won't include that here. I'm happy to answer to the extent that I can Q&A questions about it. But for now, we're dealing with desperate treatment, not desperate impact. There should be desperate impact now for sexual orientation, but I'm not so sure. All right, now finishing up, let's go to the language of Title VII. So the language of Title VII is kind of simple. It shall be unlawful for employment practice for an employer that's covered, and we already discussed who is covered, to fail or refuse to hire or discharge any individual or otherwise discriminate against an individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of, keyword, such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This is the language, and the key language here is what does because of sex means. Most historians will tell you that the word sex was entered into this section of the 1964 Civil Rights Act not to help women, but the author of the amendment actually wanted to kill the bill. He was against it because he was against civil rights at the time, and he thought, what better way to get even people who are for civil rights to vote against this as to use the innate sexism of America, I suppose. Other historians dispute that, but either way, the language around sex discrimination from the beginning of Title VII has always been disputed. And I wanted to put this here. No need to read all of these. The simple thing I want you to get from this slide is this is the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. This was needed because in 1976, the Supreme Court held that discrimination against a female who is pregnant is not discrimination because of sex. 2 years later, Congress passed a law clarifying that it is. But I point this slide out only to say from the very beginning, that case was only 12 years after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. From the very beginning, there was contention on what because of sex meant, and that's easily described and shown through the passage of the 1978 Pregnancy Discrimination Act that modified the Gilbert case. So we have two questions in the Bostock case. The first question has to do with the sexual orientation plaintiffs. The second question has to do with the transgender plaintiff, Amy Stevens. And it has to do with the language of Title VII. Here now, if I was doing a more legal presentation, I would have a lot of slides on textualism, but this decision really is kind of plain and speaks for itself. Speaking for the majority, a Trump-appointed justice, Justice Neil Gorsuch, who actually, if you remember, replaced Justice Scalia and was the justice who got to the seat that was in contention at the 2016 election, and that would have went to Merrick Garland under normal circumstances. He wrote the opinion in this case. It wasn't 5-4, it was 6-3. And he said an employer who fired an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions it would not have questioned in members of a different sex. Sex plays a necessary and undistinguishable role in the decision, exactly what Title VII forbids. Those who adopted the Civil Rights Act might not have anticipated their work would lead to this particular result, but the limits of the drafter's imagination supply no reason to ignore the law's demands. Only the written word is law, and all persons are entitled to benefit. And from that, the questions were answered. Does Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibit employment discrimination because of sex, encompass discrimination based on an individual's sexual orientation? Yes. Does that act also prohibit discrimination based on someone's what? Gender identity and gender expression, which is different from sexual orientation. Think again, the genderbread person. Yes. There's another question about sex stereotyping, which the textualist Neil Gorsuch did not go into, so I will not dive into it here, but I'm happy to take it up in Q&A. So before we get to the Q&A, how could this touch your research? Well, I've already mentioned Catholic schools and exemptions and how the court will interpret that kind of language. Just to go back to it, religious groups performing work connected to the group's religious activities. We're going to have some litigation clearly on that. Classroom conduct in higher education. What if a conscious objector who is either a professor or a professor who's a supervisor refuses to lose a student, might be a student workers pronouns, a subordinates pronouns, or contingent faculty or staff pronouns? How do we go about that? Do we say that that is a Title VII issue? It probably is not a Title VII issue because that's not discriminating in the terms of your employment, but it might be a harassment issue from now on. Parent-teacher preference in early childhood education. Suppose, I have a 2, 3, or 1-year-old, and I just don't want my child around someone that is openly gay. But I can't afford to send that child to a public school. To me, that sounds like a personal problem, but some people won't see it that way. And how are we going to adjudicate that? Title IX, a lot going on here. New regulations coming out on August 14th. I would encourage you to encourage your students to take the higher education programs, student rights and responsibilities course, where we cover this for a full 2 weeks. But the bathroom cases, I think, are answered because of sex language is the same in Title IX as it is in Title VII. The athletic cases are a little bit more mucky. And of course, pronoun use, as we already said, just in general, how will Title VII affect that? One caution before we go to the Q&A, there's this thing, a principle in law called the consistency principle, which is something I don't agree with, but it takes a lot to explain, but it does need to be understood. that whenever you formulate a right for one type of group of people, such as in this case, heterosexuals, bisexuals, lesbians, transgender people, queer people, it applies to the other contrapositive of the group as well. So race discrimination laws also apply to white students. This is why we can only do but so much, even as a private school, because it's Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act on affirmative action. All right. This principle of Title VII and Bostock will apply to heterosexuals as well. And I can guarantee you, if it's not already within the court's purview and in some lower courts, there's going to be a heterosexual that takes this case, takes the consistency principle that the court has followed and says, I was discriminated against and I wasn't hired because I was a heterosexual. And they're preferring homosexual males to teach dance or something like that. You know, to me, this is the incorporation, recolonization of civil rights law, but it's the way the law works right now, and it's something that we have to think about. All right, I went about 3 minutes over, but thank you for indulging me. And at this time, I want to spend the bulk of the rest of this presentation anyone? Silence makes me nervous. It's either I did such a good job that there are no questions, which I hesitate to believe, even in my fantasies, or I didn't do enough of a good job and I haven't generated enough interest in questions. Yes, Ms. Holland, we could unmute someone and just have an open conversation. There are no more than 30 of us on here, so I don't think that should be a problem. If everyone's unmuted, when you're talking, you can unmute while someone else is talking. If you can keep yourself muted so there's no background noise, that would be appropriate.
Okay, then Victoria, would you mind unmuting all of the attendees? Thank you.
I've gone ahead and done that.
So again, we've gone ahead and unmuted all the attendees. If you can mute yourself while others are speaking, so you don't get the background noise, and then when you're ready, just unmute you. So I have a question from Dr. Howard. And I have a question from Mary.
You know that pretty rose out there? It's kind of died back for a while.
Yeah.
I guess that happened, I guess.
Yeah, plus you probably need.
I don't think everyone knows.
A bottle of rose spray.
Victoria,
Okay.
everybody, and then they can unmute at will. So why don't you go ahead and mute them all again, and then as people want to chat and join the conversation, they can unmute at will.
Yeah, I went ahead and did that. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that, folks. To the Mary's question and then Dr. Howard's question. What do you expect will happen with the ministerial exception cases coming up? So again, if you are a minister, and the case language that governs this is a case called Hosanna Tabor, you will be exempt, and you've always been exempt from Title VII. The question there is, who is considered a minister? You understand? Is the math teacher at a Catholic high school or early childhood education center considered a minister? Definitely the religious teacher is. What about the literature teacher in which the mandatory curriculum has Catholic literature? Many, many questions about this in the court, but we do have a test. It comes from a case called Hosanna Tabor right now, and it's pretty broad as to what's a minister. Most people who work for anything religious or even remotely religious, because remember, private nonprofits count for this, are not covered by this law. I'll take Dr. Howard's question, if he can unmute, and then we'll go to Mary Bonnell. Dr. Howard, you still there? So Victoria, Dr. Howard's having trouble unmuting. I'll go ahead and answer Mary's question, and then we'll get back to Dr. Howard.
I've actually just unmuted him here if he's
Okay.
still got his question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Wright, for this session. It was very informative, especially the legal aspects of it. But I have a question, I think that connects to the gingerbread person and the acronym, if you will. So there was an article published in 2013 in the New York Times, and it's titled Generation LGBTQIA. And it's an interesting piece in that it takes up the experiences of college students at various universities. And this movement to expand the naming or self-authoring, right, that expands all the parts of the gingerbread person you identified. So increasingly, it's the community is expanding in ways I think a lot of institutions are having difficulty adjusting towards, right? And so, for example, Penn has a pretty robust program, and they have an LGBTQIA group as well as some other liberal arts colleges. So a lot of what the young people are saying in the article is that the university has created space for the traditional LGBTQ community, but for those students who don't feel a part of that acronym of sorts, just don't feel that they have a space on campus. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are about what is this sort of wider community that is sort of stepping forward and requesting support and space on campuses.
Mm-hmm. So I think that, I take that question as important. So I want to come at it from two completely different angles, if you would allow me. First, the question of the student experience. And I think that every group that tries to get rights first starts off as a small coalition and expands that coalition. As a queer person myself, part of the joys and the burdens of being queer is having to constantly explain the deconstruction of barriers that other people take for granted, and then knowing that it's a constant struggle within me as well. So I'm trying to produce a label that other people can understand while explaining for other people, particularly as researchers, why students you may interact with may have one label on Monday and another label on Friday. In my interactions and also in my research, what you see is a kind of respectability politics that dominates, particularly amongst young people of the LGBTQ dynamic, particularly of our white LGBT folks. They want, but for that characteristic, to be just like other people. Part of that is the development, as you would know as a developmental psychologist, of adolescence. And part of that is the burdens that society puts on us, particularly those that are multiply marginalized. So let me take it from another end and say that we as universities and people studying higher education need to step up to the plate and provide support for every student. So at most of the colleges that I've been at, there's been an LGBT group and then a queer people of color group. And the hope is one day we'll get them united, but it's a wider spectrum. That spectrum could include bisexuals, which is actually the largest group within the LGBT group. We lead with the L, but the research as well as the best practices on how to deal with lesbian students, particularly lesbian students and faculty of color, is lacking. And as we add that intersecting group to the LGBTQIA and the ally or other A part of it, it's incumbent on student affairs professionals and anyone that has a research agenda around students to understand that this is on a spectrum. It's constantly shifting, and therefore your expectations need to be constantly shifting, and the resources that you put to make sure that students are well in hand are constantly shifting as well. And that's a little different than the way we've run schools the last 25 years, but I suppose after 2020, the way we run a lot of things will have to change. So I hope that answers Dr. Howard's question. If not, I'm sure he'll come with a follow-up. I'll take 3 now in the chat, and then I will probably get back to if anyone has any questions. First to the question by Mary. Give me 1 second as I try to get to it. I'm sorry. Victoria or Meg, could you send me Mary Bonnell's question? Because I can't see it right now. To Mary Grace Shearer's question, how, if at all, do you think this case will affect the no promo homo laws prohibiting promotion of homosexuality in education in 6 states? As a queer pre-service teacher, I was wondering if being out as a school would be promoting sexuality. That depends, to your last point, on the state law, how that functions. No promo homo laws are probably and truly a violation of the First Amendment. We're talking right now about a statute which is hiring. You understand? So what this, to be clear, what this law prevents is a university, a organization, someone that's covered, 15 employees, not excluded, et cetera, from denying you a job or denying you promotion because you are gay. It does not cover, under Garcetti, a different case, what they can allow you to say as an employee. Many employees right now, I can think of Starbucks employees who were unable to wear Black Lives Matter paraphernalia over the last 2 weeks, have their professional and personal speech regulated at work. And this is the basis for, as you put it, the no promo homo laws. This case doesn't violate or in any way touch that, but I think separately that would be a violation for reasons I can talk about of the First Amendment. So I will now take Dr. Stone. Oh, she was just telling me something. Thank you, Ashley. I appreciate that. Mary Bonnell's, I'm sorry if I'm saying the name wrong, but we are unmuting you so you can ask your question directly. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been great. I think my question is about.
Did I get your name? Did I get your last name correct? Let me know.
Yep, yes, you did. Yes, you did.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So, I'm a part of a board, and just recently there's been pushback that we're an organization that gives funding to women, and through Title IX there was pushback to remove whatever restrictions around funding, particularly for a gender or a sex. But I think my larger question really is about that sort of consistency. I can't remember what you said. The
Consistency principle, yes. Mm-hmm.
So, given this, in the future, do you foresee unintended consequences of this? I'm just wondering how that sort of allows pushback for protections or the intention of the law to protect groups.
Yeah, it allows it. I think that part of the problem with our laws right now, and I can say this because this isn't a legal panel, I'm talking to educators and social science researchers, is that one, it doesn't really remedy much. It's only forward looking. It doesn't take into consequences the things that came before. So in 1986, when gay sex was found legally criminal in the Bowers case, from 1986 to 2003, there were many gay men who were arrested, lost jobs, lost pensions for things that would be 100% legal and even celebrated on culture right now. And there's very little we can go back and do about that because our law is forward looking. The other problem with our law is we are committed in a way that is unhealthy, unwise, and unrealistic to characteristic blindness, best articulated through color blindness when it comes to the racial context, but even heterosexual or, even in sometimes economic blindness when it comes to other sets of cases. this commitment to blindness creates this consistency principle that would allow a heterosexual male to sue GW because the last 4 hires were females, even though heterosexual white males have been the dominant hires in higher education for as long as we've been writing about higher education. It's unfortunate, but it is a possibility. As far as your particular situation, I would hesitate to, offer any legal advice on it. I don't know if this case would affect that, but there's definitely some First Amendment implications. To another question, one of my students asked, talking about college student identity, gender expression, and intersectionality between race, ethnicity, and gender, where should the research go towards? Well, I have 3 places where I can send it to. Of course, I am not as arrogant to think that you should take my advice on research. So here is kind of the platform where I would put you on and hope you can find the specific nugget yourself. The research, I think, definitely needs to go to our lesbian sisters, whether they be transgender or cisgender, and research on particular categories of lesbians. A lot of the research on LGBT really is just a G. So, lesbians of color, non-cisgender lesbians, religious lesbians, conservative lesbians, we need some more research there. As I said, the largest block of LGBT is really the bisexual nature. So I'm conducting a study right now looking at the phenomenological essence of what it is to be bisexual and biracial, developing on some multiple marginal theories in higher education. I think, even though it's part of my research agenda, the research should definitely go there. And then we've got to find a way to stop the violence, both metaphorically done by institutions and, systemically against our trans students, our trans brothers and sisters, and our trans people of color. And I think the research has to go to what type of education do cisgender people need to go through, whether it be training or just basic changes to K through 12 curriculum, so that the violence against that particular part of our community stops.
I've got a question from Dr. Green. I'm gonna unmute him.
Please go ahead.
Okay, you're unmuted.
Thank you. Dr. Wright, thank you so much indeed for this presentation. I echo Dr. Howard's comments that I've learned a lot in terms of how you framed the main concerns. But I was struck by a comment you made when you showed the slide of the Black and Latinx trans women who you believe and you would assert have been at the forefront of much of the pivotal points of this revolution. And you made a comment whereby, and I'm paraphrasing you, you said, at some point, these faces were students in our K-12 classrooms and could very well be our students in higher ed. And I thought that was just a beautifully emotional, but yet just targeted, focused way of the humanization that has been necessary for the LGBTQIA community throughout history and throughout all of the landmark cases that you highlighted. And I want to pick up on the very last comment that you made in response to your students' question about research agendas. What, in fact, do you see in the field of education, whether K-12 or in higher ed, if we are to humanize these folks that you showed in your slide, what are the policies and practices that you would see as being critically urgent in our work in the field of education? And can we learn from other disciplines that are somewhat ahead of us? Because we typically think of ourselves as a fairly conservative discipline. Are there more progressive disciplines that we can look to and say, we might be able to learn from those? Thank you for my long-winded commentary and question to you.
No, I think it's well taken, and it's a lot there, so I'll try to tackle it all. First and foremost, I think it starts in the way we're training our educators. I think we at GSEHD and educators in general have a huge responsibility. Whereas more kids will watch LeBron James, you as a K through 12 teacher, you as even a higher ed teacher have more impact one-on-one on any student than any basketball player, movie star, or in some cases, even the President of the United States. Knowing that that responsibility means you have to treat every student as if you would treat every other student, and not just have the rhetoric of it, but actually treat them the same. Make a warm and welcoming environment for any student, regardless of their characteristics. And it should be within teacher preparation, within higher education preparation, psychology preparation, counseling, et cetera, where that is actually happening. And unfortunately, it's not. We see a lot of our curriculums absent of the detail and the sensitivity, particularly to our trans brothers and sisters, but even to other members of the LGBT community, that they really deserve. Two things that I think would impact policies that would change that right away. Having a mandatory diversity class in the curriculum with a couple of weeks on LGBT issues, where you can take something like the gender bread, break it down, do some practical work, have students write on it and reflect on it. And I think the first part of it is the curriculum. And that represents the old adage of the Jeffrey Melman curriculum diversity, intersectional diversity, and of cosmopolitan diversity, or, numbers diversity. So I think the second thing has to go with that point right there, with numbers diversity. We need more intentional outreach to students of LGBT characteristics, self-identifying, but particularly those students of color who are doubly marginalized, and particularly those students who are trans. They may be not just triply marginalized, but who knows, maybe we have a trans Muslim student, someone with a pre-existing condition, et cetera, et cetera. More outreach to let these people know that there are role models out there and there are places you can actually go. We're very good at GSEHD at doing certain things. I think we could be the better at, one, presenting an atmosphere that is more comfortable to everyone else, and then actually making things happen. I would love to see within the next 5 years a trans faculty member, a trans staff member, or a significant increase in our trans students, and a change in the atmosphere through the culture that allows people to be as out as they possibly can. Very quickly, because I want to move to our community discussion after I survey the questions. When I first got here, I had someone who will go nameless tell me that I used the word husband too much. And I told that person that I'd rather use the word husband too much and sleep at home than have to sleep in the office. Something like that, I think, was a joke. I really do think it was. But you wouldn't say that, I don't think, to a heterosexual person, right? So that calls for a cultural evaluation of what we're doing, and then some specific practices to that evaluation to change around. So if I had to give you two things, I would say more outreach, maybe K through 12 programming to show trans and other people of LGBT descent that they can go other places, and two, more investment in resources to bring some of them into our family. Okay, before we get to the community conversation, I have a question about, does the extension of the LGBTQIA acronyms dilute any legal arguments? I think they did before the kind of Kennedy revolution, starting with Romer in 1996 and completing with Obergefell in 2015, because before the Kennedy revolution, you had to kind of fit a certain box. And was really the box that fit the African-American kind of binary, right? You had to prove that your trait was immutable or unchangeable. And that was very hard for LGBT people to do. So back to the respectability politics of the community, many people, including bisexuals and transgender people, were kind of excluded from earlier movements in order to make them more placable to those that, quite frankly, were oppressing. But I don't think that's the case right now. Thank you, Kristen, for joining. I know you have to go. I have other comments here. As I peruse, I would like to, if at all possible, continue this, of course, for the next 10 minutes, but move to an extension of this conversation to what we need to do in GSEHD to make this place a more welcoming for members of the LGBT community. I have felt welcome, so this is not me trying to produce my own story, but we do want to hear, and I think what you saw in the community conversation a couple of weeks ago is a willingness to start having some conversations that we haven't had in the past. So, I'm more than willing to take questions on anything, but if anyone now has any suggestions on how to make GSEHD better when it comes to those that are lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, or questioning, I'll take those comments at this time. Please don't be shy. No one? Then I can make a comment about there being no comments, because I know we're not perfect, but I want to see if anyone has anything. Beyond conversations, yes, if you have suggestions for action, things that you saw at other schools, maybe Dr. Howard, you have a recommendation. Dr. Ali, I see your question and I will take that before I exit. Dr. Howard. Victoria, if we can get him unmuted again.
He is unmuted.
Thank you.
Thank you. You can hear me?
Yes, sir.
So a possible way to help shift the community culture climate here at GSEHD will be to think about programming that invites members from the larger community. DC has a pretty robust and diverse LGBTQIA community, and this might be an opportunity to think about sort of co-sponsoring or co-programming together, even co-hosting events on campus that brings that conversation. And similarly, we might even think about scholars who are taking these issues within the context of educational research to come and present their work. There's a queer SIG and AERA that's actually quite active. And even within that SIG, there's a real diverse and inclusive community within that. And there are, people who are doing this work. So what does it mean to take up these issues in the K-12 space? Like, it would be great to have those folks come and present. I think we can increase our invitation to taking up this work.
Thank you for that, Dr. Howard. I agree. I think part of my commitment to doing forums like this and putting energy behind this is, one, this happens to also be my research agenda. But two, I think, we do need a little bit more energy beyond these efforts to connect, not just in GSEHD, because we try to do a lot with a little here, but around the DC area to actually show our community commitments and maybe, spark some more interest in GSEHD and GW as a whole. Any other recommendations? I know I have a question from Dr. Ali that I will end with, but in the
I
meantime,
thought
yes,
Ken Hergenrather said he can offer some recommendations.
please go ahead, Ken. If you can unmute him, Victoria.
Yeah, sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to share with you that GSEHD has been supportive of these events. And I started these years ago. So in 2012, I brought in Dylan Orr, and I'm not sure if you know who Dylan Orr is, but he was the first transgender appointee by a presidential administration. Barack Obama appointed him. I brought him to GSEHD. GSEHD was very supportive of this. We got a room in the Marvin Center. We had publicity, and we only had about 20 people in the room from the university. That was 2012. Okay, so let's move forward. I brought in knowing General Tammy Smith, the first female lesbian general of the U.S. military. And then Max was supportive of that. Michael was supportive of it. We even brought in food catered, sent everything out to the universities. Meg was aware of this. To the schools. I think we had 30 people come to that. So what I'm sharing is this information. I also offered a master's doctoral level course on LGBT, working with LGBT students and clients for a more inclusive workplace and society. I had 4 students come to that, and that was offered in the spring of 2018. I'm sorry, spring of 2019. So my point is that we can market this and we can put this out there. We have to find another way to bring people in. So
any suggestions on that other way, Ken? Any suggestions on what that other way might be, or things that we haven't tried that we probably should be, and for some reason we just had never had the opportunity to?
You know, I think there are things in regard to when people can attend, although even though we ask them, but I think we're going to have to do it through networking with other schools. We're going to have to find those sentinels. Who are those people in those schools that allow us access to groups? How can we provide GSEHD as being known for being receptive to this? And I will share with you, so I've instructed our internship in our Community Counseling Servicing Center. I've taught the course for the past 16 years. I'm in my 60th section of internship, and we've noticed a significant number of GW students who come to our clinic who identify within the LGBTQI. And it's a significant over the past, I would say 5 years. It's probably gone from 2% to probably, I would say, 25%. So there are a lot of students. So there's a need. We see the community growing on campus, as you said. So in regard to bringing more people, heightening awareness, I think reaching out, letting people know about our school, and also maybe creating a group of experts or having people know who is at GSEHD, who addresses this, and having these events like this forum. Those are just some initial thoughts. But I think just to say that we have done some things, we've brought some significant people in, and maybe it wasn't the right time, but at least we heightened awareness. But I think really to bring more people into these meetings and have more events is wonderful, like what you're doing.
Yeah, I think we also need to work on the culture. You know, I think there's a culture where a lot of students, you know, text me, emailed me ahead of time and said, you know, Dr. Wright, I would love to join the session, but I'm just not comfortable at GSEHD with people knowing that I'm even associated with something that might associate me with being gay.
Yes.
And that's a culture problem. You know, that's on us. That's something we need to fix. And as long as I'm here, I'm committed to working with you, Ken, or anyone to try to fix it.
Yeah, and I'll share with you, so it reminds me of all of my years in HIV and AIDS since the mid 80s. And I remember, it somewhat happens today, but I would say over the past 20 years, it wouldn't be uncommon to have a presentation at a national conference on HIV and AIDS, and you knew you would have 2 or 3 people, because people were really concerned with being associated with that. So right, let's work on changing the culture. I'm glad to do whatever I can.
Thanks, Ken. So here's how we're going to wrap it up, because we're right at 4:15. We're going to do Dr. Jim Williams and then Dr. Ashley Stone. Before we do that, Victoria, let me answer Dr. Ali's question. So after Dr. Stone's comment, we will be done. Dr. Ali's question is, beyond legal protections and safe spaces for students, what are the ways university can be not only not safe for LGBTQA students, but rather be open to queer ways of knowing and being in the world? And that has to do with the thing that that Dr. Ali is the one thing that I think faculty keep as sacred. And if we're going to deal with any of this DEI stuff, to be quite frankly, they're going to have to give a little bit on. And that is epistemological and ontological stances. We might be diverse-ish at GSEHD, maybe, depending on how you look at it, but we're very conservative when it comes to epistemological and ontological stances towards research. And I think that one way to show, to Ken's point of changing the culture, is to show that we approach research and diverse issues in untraditional ways. You understand? So I think, you know, a queer way of thinking, to use Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology, is a way of thinking that goes against the norm. And, you know, there's going to be hard choices. Do you seek to try to be the best at the norm and continue to get the same people from the same schools that produce the same work because you just want to compete with everyone else? Or do you take that risk? And that's a conversation we as faculty need to have, should have been having, and I'm hoping we'll continue to have come September when we talk more about this. So we're going to go to Jim Williams and then Dr. Ashley Stone, and we will be done.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You can. Good. All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much for offering this. And it's a wonderful time. In 20 some years, this is the first occasion to discuss these issues at a GSEHD forum that I've experienced. But admittedly, I didn't go to Ken's opportunities and should have. I realize that now. There are opportunities we don't take advantage of. Two quick comments. One of them is I don't know how to put this, but I think given my position in the university and my demographic characteristics, I'm not as aware as I could be, and because of the invisibility we, our community can assume, I'm not as aware of the different ways in which GSEHD students, faculty, staff feel marginalized in terms of these issues, and would be interested in some kind of, information, maybe a survey, an anonymous survey of, delicately put, of ways in which people feel marginalized. I personally feel pretty well supported, but I think there are many ways in which maybe I'm not as supported, and certainly other people who are in less, less secure positions probably feel much more so. It would be nice to have a place where students could go to, and I guess they do for counseling, but just for kind of GSEHD support. And maybe faculty as well, place they could go and get, just to talk to other people studying their subjects and in the same institution. So that's a thought. It could be quite helpful for people who are shy. And the third point is shy and, rightfully worried about their status and the implications. The third is the US is better than some places internationally in terms of LGBTQIA issues. And I think one service we can provide is the opportunity for students from places that are less supportive, and the US is not perfect, but places that are less supportive to see how we do things, and not that they should do them the same way we do, but as ideas and as inspiration for their own communities. If nothing else, just to make people aware that there are LGBTQIA folks among them here, and such. So my three ideas.
Now, thank you for that, Dr. Williams. I particularly like that last point. As someone that was not born here and grew up for a small part of my life as an undocumented American, as a queer undocumented American and closeted at that point as well, my experience was very different, because, I was always worried not just about, doing the right thing, but doing the perceived right thing to society. And it came from, a background that wasn't necessarily an American upbringing. So I definitely like that point, and I think it goes right into our mission. And hopefully we can talk more about that. Dr. Ashley Stone, if you're still here, we'll take your comment and then we'll wrap up.
I am still, okay, no, I am still here, yes, and I'm unmuted. It's not changing color, so. You'd think after this many months I'd be better at it. Thank you so much. Ashley Stone, I use she, her, hers pronouns. I think that one of the things that we can think about is also not just in events, but how can we individually be making our classrooms and spaces more inclusive with things that are not just with the curriculum, but making sure that in the buildings we're teaching in, we know where maybe gender neutral bathrooms are in case students are in need of those, normalizing the sharing of pronouns, but in ways that don't force students to out themselves if they are not ready and don't want to share those things. I think those are some general practices we can think about how we're setting up our classrooms to help with things like that. I last week actually was able to attend a seminar or a webinar that was actually on inclusion of LGBTQIA2S+ students in virtual environments, it can be found at the University of Arizona Institute for LGBT Studies. If there's a way for me to send out some of these resources, I'm happy to do that. But it was a full webinar on thinking about inclusion in online learning for these groups of students. I think we can think about the ways in which we want to use or in the same ways that we want to make sure our curriculum and the scholars that we include in our syllabi are diverse racially and ethnically, that we're also looking at diverse representations across gender, across an entire, like not just a gender binary, but an entire gender spectrum, as well as an entire spectrum of sexual orientation. And so I just think there are lots of different ways that we can begin to think about how we disrupt sort of some of the things that we normally do and look at the structures that we have in our classrooms. And again, I'm happy to share some of those resources. I also know earlier, I have an article that I use that sort of talks about the evolution of the acronym from a trans scholar of color who's written about that and how it will continue to evolve and the reasons why we do that. And also addresses a little bit the ways that some of the terms we use are sort of from a colonial or European Western perspective. And so things like our Two-Spirit students who are Indigenous actually view gender and sexuality in really different ways. And so for our students from other cultures, it might also be that they view themselves wholly differently. And how can we respect the ways they understand their own identity that don't necessarily fit into sort of the boxes we've created for them. Sorry, that was a lot, but I have lots of different resources if there's a place where I can submit them all. If people are interested, that's sort of the variety of where the resources lie, and I'd be happy to supply them in some space if there's an easy place for people to access them from.
No, so thank you first, Ashley, for attending, and thank you for doing that. What we'll ask is that if you have resources, that you send them to Victoria. I will send this slide for correction and to Victoria as well. And eventually we will get all those resources up on our DEI website, when that will be our practice going forward for most, if not all, of these sessions. So if you have resources, Dr. Stone, feel free to share them with me so I can read them. But for you and anyone else that wants to post it for the community, if you could send it to Victoria. Victoria, I hope that's okay. And she will assemble it and we'll get it up on the website.
Fantastic, thanks.
For everyone else, we've reached the end of this, but I don't want this to be the end of the conversation. So if you have more suggestions, feel free to email me. When you get my email, my phone number is right on there. Text me, have a phone call. Let's continue having these conversations. This month, we have 2 other events, as Dr. Green, Colin and Julia are doing Unpacking Whiteness, and then Christine is doing something on equity online at the end of the month. Let's try to get a little bit more attendance at these events. You know, the best way to do diversity wrong is for 5 or 6 people to be really involved into the next tragedy. We don't want that. We were in that unfortunate position last month. And, you know, I want to start planning for the next year's Pride Forum right away. And, you know, if we could get some more attendance at these events, it could really go away to show that GSEHD cares about this, GW cares about this, we as a faculty, staff, and students care about this as well. So that's my little plug to the rest of the events going on. I thank everyone that attended. Again, if you have any other questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to email me. It's a simple email, dwaynewright@gw.edu, and I will also take suggestions for further programming or other things there as well. Are there any further questions, comments, or anything else that I would need to address before we leave today? Seeing and hearing none, I'd like to thank Victoria, Meg, and Torin for the wonderful assistance they have given me this week and throughout my time here as well. We truly couldn't do these things without you, and I want you to publicly say how grateful I am to be working with you all. Thank you everyone that attended. I will see you again hopefully soon, and until then, please keep this on your mind, keep it into your heart. Let's keep asking and answering good questions of each other. All right. Have a good evening, everyone. I appreciate it.